Hello and welcome back to Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws. Today's conversation is one you're not going to want to miss. It's with Charles Feltman, the author of The Thin Book of Trust. And he joined me to chat about the third edition of the book that came out in September of 2024. And we're talking about why trust is so foundational to workplace success. But before we hear from Charles, I want to thank our sponsor, Xenium HR. They offer a full service of HR solutions, but they also have learning and development packages tailored for every team. They've got on-demand courses, which are a flexible way to learn anytime, wherever you are, starting at $99 per month for an entire organization. There's also a package that includes on-demand courses and live virtual workshops. This is unlimited monthly workshops and on-demand courses starting at $199 per month for an employer. And then they have the full learning and development program. It's everything that's on-demand courses, virtual workshops, and leadership cohorts on an unlimited basis, starting at $399 per month for an employer. Xenium knows that investing in your team's growth can transform your organization. So be sure to check out Xenium HR for more details. All right, let's get into the conversation with Charles Feltman, and make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn and subscribe to Transform Your Workplace on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. We've got weekly episodes and tons of great stuff coming in 2025. Enjoy the conversation with Charles Feltman, the author of The Thin Book of Trust. Charles, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, Brandon.
Yeah, we've been circling for a while. We finally have this on the books. We're going to talk about your book, The Thin Book of Trust. This is the third edition. It's out September 10th, 2024. We're recording this in November. And you start the book by discussing how trust really underpins both success and well-being, work, and in our personal lives. What inspired you to write this first edition back in 2009, and now you have this third edition, but why do you see trust as foundational to the workplace specifically?
Well, having worked in some different workplaces, I experienced both trust that was strong and solid, and what it did. I experienced the strong productivity that followed from strong trust and a foundation of trust in the relationships between people in the organization, and also experienced what happens when people don't trust each other and how that really tanks productivity and also damages people's well-being. So I've experienced both, and that's it. It's why I wanted to get this particular information out there, because the book is basically about a particular framework and set of distinctions I have used and worked with my clients using for a number of years, and they have found it valuable. And so putting in a book then allows me to get that out to a whole lot more people than I can one-on-one or one-on working with a team or whatever.
In the introduction, you had a great section on, I think it's called the Trust Quiz, and it's really a self-assessment on how trusting am I, how trusting are others, and this reminded me of the whole like the Lake Wobegon effect of like people rating themselves above IQ all the time compared to other people, and that's exactly what you found in this is like people tend to rate themselves more trustworthy than others. So that's how they self-assess. Why is there a gap? Why does that happen where people rate themselves as like being more trustworthy than others?
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly more trustworthy than other people.
I mean, I would probably say the same thing. But.
Well, I think actually part of that is there's a scientific term for it, which I can't remember right now. And that's because no one should trust my memory. But I think it's that we tend to either overvalue our own ability or undervalue it. And a lot of people tend to overvalue it when it comes to trustworthiness. I'm really trustworthy. It's other people who are less trustworthy than me. Now, that little quiz, I gave it to, I actually put it out on LinkedIn and a couple of other ways, and with clients and so on. And as I ended up putting it out to about 120 people altogether. So this wasn't thousands. It was about 120 people. This was not a scientifically validated study. It was just, hey, what do you think? And there were certainly, when you average the numbers, the trust level that comes out highest is self-trust. I trust, or not self-trust, but I am trustworthy more so than other people. People were giving themselves higher marks for their own trustworthiness than other people, but that doesn't mean everybody did that. I think a lot of people may have undervalued or said something about their own trustworthiness that was maybe more realistic.
I'm sure a lot of people have a different definition of trust, and maybe it's met with behaviors and actions of people. But one of your definitions of trust is, quote, choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to others' actions, end quote. Why is vulnerability such an important part of trust?
Because it's inherent in trusting someone. When we trust someone, we're in effect giving them some amount of control over something that's important to us, something we value. Let's just say I've done some work on something and I think it's really good work, and I share it with a colleague, or actually sometimes a bigger issue is when I share it with my boss. And then I'm doing so assuming that my boss is going to, give me credit for it in places where I would like to have credit for it. So when my boss actually talks to his boss and his peers, or her boss and her peers about it, but as if it's their work, there's an example of someone actually not taking care of or being considerate of what I value. So they have damaged, in a way, what I value in this situation. And I have no control over that. I can ask them to not do that, but I typically wouldn't, right? I just imagine that they're going to do the right thing. And there's so many situations in which we do that, and we do it because we assume that that other person will not harm what it is that we value. And even more importantly, in trusting that other person and then sharing that information, or having them trusting their competence in something or something, any of those kinds of things. Boy, I'm really tripping over my words here. Should have gotten a cup of tea before I started this. But when we trust someone, we're making an assumption that they're going to uphold or at the very least not harm what it is we value. And that in trusting them, we're going to be able to do some good work together. If I don't trust them, I'm going to withhold, I'm going to pull back, I'm not going to work with them, I'm going to distance myself from them, and work suffers.
I think what makes organizations so complex, especially when you have smaller organizations and start growing, the number of individual connections and relationships varies greatly. And if your levels of trust vary at the individual level, that's where things get complicated when you're working cross-functionally in different teams. How can we really self-assess any given relationship, maybe a trust check? Are there questions we can ask ourselves to just really be real about our trust that we have with any given person?
Yes, that's a great question. So when we go into that, I am going to risk making something I value vulnerable to another person. Part of that is we're making a risk assessment of some kind, right? We're making the assessment that this person will in fact support or not damage what I value. And that risk assessment is, if it's well made, if we do so wisely, then the risk itself, the level of risk in doing that and trusting that other person goes down. So how do you do that wisely is the question you're asking. And what I would say to that is, when I talk with people about trust, when I work with people about trust, I don't leave it as this big kind of poorly defined amorphous thing. Rather, I find that it's much more useful to break it into four somewhat distinct but interrelated assessment domains. So I assess trust of another person's trustworthiness in these four different domains of trust, and they in turn are doing the same of me. And in doing so, I can get much more fine grained and specific about that other person's trustworthiness and they of mine, and be able to also take a look at, okay, I can trust this person in this area, this domain, which is really directly relevant to what I'm risking in trusting them. And I may not be able to trust them so much in another domain, but that maybe isn't so important because it's not as germane to what it is I'm risking in trusting them in this particular situation.
We're going to get into those four domains in a second, but you had a quote in one of your chapters. I wanted you to unpack it for me. So it's from Brene Brown. I'm a huge fan, as I'm sure you are. The quote says, "Trust is the stacking and layering of small moments and reciprocal vulnerability over time," end quote. Unpack that for me, and then give me some insight, and listeners too, about why those small moments matter so much.
I think Brene says it so well. In not just in the particular book that I quoted from, but in other places, in other writings, in other books that she's had. She really brings it home that trust is built over time. And it's built by me extending some trust to you. And in that risk, I'm taking that risk. I'm making myself vulnerable. And your response is that you come back and you act in a way that maybe not only does not damage what I've made vulnerable to you, but it actually supports it and enlarges our relationship with each other so that we can do more together. And that's typically in like she says, a stacking and layering of those back and forth. So now I'm trusting you a little bit, but you also feel like, okay, maybe I can risk trusting Charles a little bit. So you do, and we go through our work lives together, kind of risking smaller things, and eventually we get to the point where we feel like we can risk larger things with each other, more important things that we're more vulnerable around and that are more important to us.
I think when I read that quote and just the content of that section in particular, it reminded me of like Stephen Covey's work with the emotional bank account and just describing like, we can make deposits, those moments where we can extend trust and vulnerability and those build up over time, but you could easily take it away just as fast too. And I think this applies to what you're talking about as well.
I have often thought that old adage, takes years to build strong trust and it can all be damaged, disappear, be betrayed in a moment. That yes, that does happen from time to time because the betrayal is so big. But generally, I think just as trust is built in the small moments, it can be damaged in little ways, in small ways. And if the foundation of trust is there and it's strong in the first place, if the people involved are willing to confront it and say, what's going on? You did this, and I see that as kind of untrustworthy here, and tell me about it. What was going on for you? And have a conversation about it. The point of which is to restore trust. That those smaller things, and even sometimes pretty big breaches and betrayals of trust, can actually be pretty quickly repaired. And in fact, even if it's done well, the trust between those people can be strengthened when trust has been damaged in some even significant ways.
That's so well said, because I think where the damage can be done is if things are left unsaid. No apology is made when one's deserved, and just really no dialogue about why this happened and how we can repair it. But like when you come together, things can, like you said, you can repair what happened, but probably build on it, knowing that like, oh, if something happens again, I can actually come back to the table. We can renegotiate. We can work through it together because I know I can trust you.
Yeah. And that's for me one of the most important things about trust building in general is it works best when we talk about it.
Yeah. So the four domains you talked about earlier, we'll just name them real quick. It's care, sincerity, reliability, and competence. And I want to get into each of these. And let's start with care. How can leaders show up for their people, showing that they truly care about both the success in their work life just as much as their personal life, and just how that impacts their well-being?
Yeah, well, first I want to step back and actually define or talk about what I mean by care in this sense. It's the assessment that I can trust that you have my interests in mind as well as your own. You know, you're not going to put mine above yours, but that you have my interests in mind as well as your own when you make decisions and take action. So you're thinking about me, and that you intend good for me when you act coming from a place of good intention. Now that doesn't always work out that way in practice, but at least you're intending good for me in your actions. And so a lot of what leaders who are very effective at building trust in the domain of care with people they lead and their peers and even their bosses comes down to listening well so that the other person has a sense that, oh, this person actually cares about me enough to listen to me in this fast-paced, crazy, everybody running around like chickens with their heads cut off environment. My boss or teammate of mine or whatever is actually taking the time to listen to me. And that right there builds a strong trust, can build trust in the domain of care. Asking questions that, again, are questions not to close down the other person, but to open them up. So questions that are open-ended, that open the topic or subject that they're talking about further, questions that relate to the person, and little things like I remember once a client I was talking to was really upset because her boss came into their office every day, walked straight by her desk, her cubicle, and several other cubicles of people who on the team, and went right into his actual office where he could close the door without saying anything to anybody. And what that said to her is that he really didn't notice her, care about her in any particular way. A small thing, but that was the assessment that she had, and at least if I believed her, most of the other people in this particular group had about him. So little things like that, little listening, asking questions, remembering a conversation that you and I, for example, had, a week ago or something, remembering that conversation and bringing it back up in the current moment when it might be relevant. That's another place where this person pays attention to me. They're listening to me. They care about me.
Sincerity is another element. What do you mean by sincerity? And give maybe some examples of like how leaders can practice this.
Yeah, sincerity is a really important one also, in that it is a combination for me of honesty and integrity. That is to say, when you say something to me, I can believe it. I don't have to fact check you, that you have you fact checked yourself, and that what you're telling me is true to the best of your knowledge. And also that you act with integrity. That is, when you say something, you'll follow that up with actions that support it, and not do things that will in some way contradict what it is you said. Not just actions, but also other, speaking again to other people or even to me later on. There's a consistency in what you say and what you do that I can see over time, including even if you change your mind about something somewhere along the line. You tell me, oh, hey, this is what I want you to do. This is the important thing here. Go off and do this. And then, a week later, you come back to me and say, hey, Charles, I just want you to know I've changed my mind about that. I want you actually working on this because this is why I want you. It's why I changed my mind and want you working on this. But I want you to hear it from me and not somebody else.
This whole idea of sincerity, of like, it sounds like walking the talk, essentially. Like you're saying something, you're backing it up with actions. What about leaders who they are having a hard time with the consistency between their words and actions? And it's not maybe out of ill intent, but those, as we talked about earlier, the small actions build up over time. So for leaders who struggle with this, any tips, ideas, and how to bridge that gap?
Well, I think, first of all, behaving in a way that others see as trustworthy in any of these domains, in all of these domains, requires some degree of attention to what's important. Saying it's one thing to commit to being trustworthy. I want to be trustworthy. But then you have to, and here's a good example of it right here, declaring I want to be trustworthy, but then following it up by paying attention to what I'm doing, so that I don't accidentally, or I minimize the opportunities where I can accidentally damage trust with somebody in that particular domain or in those ways. So that's part of it. And another part of it, of course, is having these 4 assessment domains as a way of thinking about a lens through which to observe my behavior and check in with myself. So, for example, I asked a group of people I was doing some work with over a couple week period of time that if they would simply just at the end of every day run through each of the 4 trust domains and note down actions that they took and things that they said in each of those domains, and how well that could either be building trust with others around them or could potentially be damaging it. And they actually went out and did it. I was kind of surprised that they were willing to acknowledge places where they had done something that was potentially untrustworthy or could be seen as untrustworthy by other people. But that's a little way that you can kind of check yourself and be accountable to yourself around trustworthy behavior.
Reliability is the third domain. What do you mean by reliability, and share some examples of that?
Yeah, that one is unlike walking your talk, the domain of sincerity, where you follow up your words with actions that support that. This is a little more specific, actually a lot more specific. It's very specifically keeping the commitments that you make to other people. If I say, okay, Brandon, I'm going to show up at 2:00 on the 4th of November and be ready to do a podcast episode with you, then I do it. I'm there at 4:00. I have the equipment that you asked me to have. I'm ready to jump in and have the conversation. Then I've fulfilled the commitment that I made to you. If I had not showed up, had shown up 15 minutes late, if I'd shown up but my tech wasn't there, wasn't ready, I hadn't really thought much about it, whatever, I'm not really meeting the commitment that I'd made. And this is it may seem like a pretty straightforward thing, but this is one of the places where people are constantly undermining how other people see them in terms of their trustworthiness. I'm going to go back and say something else that we didn't talk about a moment ago, but I'm going to add it in here. In general, when we see trust as one big thing, binary. Either I trust you or I don't trust you. We also then, if I find some little behavior that you exhibit that I see as untrustworthy, it's going to raise a little question in my mind, and I'm going to start wondering about and looking for other things that I should not trust you in doing, or other ways that I should not trust you, other situations. And so people don't really think about that when they don't do what they say they're going to do. They don't meet their commitments on time or in terms of the product that they've committed to or whatever. Oh, just something got in the way. I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. They don't realize that people are beginning to, after 2 or 3 times, 4 times, that people are starting to go, I don't think I can trust this person. I don't think I can trust Charles. He's, and not only that, but I can't trust him in the domain of sincerity, perhaps, and maybe even care, So this is a domain that I end up doing a lot of work with clients around. And as you probably recall, as you read the book, in the chapter on reliability, there's a whole section on what I call the cycle of commitment, a way of making clear and complete requests and responding to those requests, again, in a clear and complete way that leads to strong agreements, or perhaps no agreement, because I recognize that I can't actually fulfill your request. So I need to tell you that up front. But in either case, at the end of it, there's a clear agreement. Yes, I'm going to go off and do what we've agreed about, or I'm not going to do it. And now you can go look for someone else. There may be a negotiation in there about what it is that I'm going to do. You ask me to do A, and I come back to you and say, I can do A, and I can do it by this date, but not by the date that you're asking me for. Or I can do 3/4 of A by the date you're asking me for. And so we have a negotiation around that and come up with what will work given all the other things that I know I have, all the other commitments that I know I have on my plate.
It's probably hard to pick a favorite element of trust. To me, in reading all of these ideas, I'm like, reliability is like the foundation, because if I know that you're going to show up for me and you're going to do what you say you're going to do, or if you, like you said earlier, you can't fulfill it and you'll come back to the table and renegotiate with me, to me, this is like the quickest way of building trust, other than just, being sincere and caring for me. This is like the one where at probably the smallest level, this builds up over time. Just an observation. I'm curious if you have and we haven't got to the fourth one yet, but if you have one that's most important.
Well, let's go to the fourth one and then I'll answer that question.
Yeah, let's do that. The fourth, competence. So unpack this one for me.
Competence is basically, I trust that you have the knowledge, skills, experience, expertise, resources to do what I'm asking you to do, or to do what you say you can do, that you're proposing to do. Or if you don't, you'll let me know. When you go off to do it, I have a reasonable expectation that you'll be able to. Competence, though, it's not just straightforward in that sense. There's a couple of layers to it. So one of them that's important is for us to have an explicit agreement about what standards we're talking about here. So if it's competence, let's say, in the domain of, let's just talk about leading or being a good podcast interviewer. So he's a competent podcast interviewer. Brandon's great at that. Well, what have we agreed on about what that looks and sounds like? So you and I had a conversation up front where you pretty much told me, this is how I run a podcast. And as I listen, I'm listening, okay, actually that he does know how to do this. I'm making an assessment that, he knows how to do this. He's done it. He's got his tech down. He's got his process down. He knows what he's aiming at. Okay, good. And so those are standards around which you and I can agree. Now, we didn't say, hey, we agree on this, but if I came back to you later and said, I didn't like that, how you interviewed me in that podcast, you might ask me, well, what were you expecting? What were the standards that you were using? And that happens all the time on teams where people, some people hold other people or judge other people as not sufficiently competent, but they haven't really determined what the standards are that they're holding each other to. So, and then there's the piece about being honest about what it is you can and can't do. So, getting back to the question of which of these is the most important, I recall, and I had this question in the back of my mind, and I was asking it to a team that I was working with, and it was a team of engineers, and hands down, it was the domain of competence was the most important one. So you think about it in their environment, that's really important. In a sales with a sales team, you might have them all go, some agreement around sincerity and care, or reliability is going to be another important one for salespeople. So it's somewhat context dependent. Who is it that you're talking to? What are they working on? What's the situation? Sometimes when someone is just starting in a new position, new company, they're having to sort of quickly build trust with other people. I'll recommend that they focus initially on reliability and competence. If they build trust, which is easy to do if you do it well, if you are scrupulous about meeting the commitments that you make and you don't overcommit so that's, stuff is falling off your plate. So you're able to do that and people start seeing you as highly reliable, that they can trust your reliability, and that you are clearly competent in what you do. And if you don't think you can do something to the standard that other people are expecting, which means you have to ask them, then they see you as competent and they're going to trust you in that domain. That happens fairly quickly. So over, maybe your first 3-4 months, you can build a sense of trust. And then the sincerity and care, which are equally important in strong trust over time, you can start focusing more on those.
Charles, you also touch on distrust as a deliberate choice to avoid vulnerability. So if leaders are listening and they might have some team members that just aren't vulnerable and that's coming up as a distrust amongst team, how do we bring people along? It's hard you can't force people to be vulnerable, but how do we bring people along so we can connect our teams better?
I think this is a real trust building skill in terms of, again, listening, holding the space for other people, as a leader going first in demonstrating trustworthy behavior in all 4 domains, but in particular in the domains of care and sincerity for people who are sort of low trust. They're moving in with low trust, and so they're not willing to to be vulnerable, and then they're behaving in ways that aren't good for the team, that don't support the team working well together. So they're withholding information. They're not really contributing their good thinking to brainstorming sessions or whatever. Now, that's not going to work, like you say. So how do you help them open up? You listen, you ask questions, you focus on the ideas and task at hand, and stay away from character. So you don't characterize them. I had a boss once who, this was before I knew this much about trust building, but he came into a team meeting and kind of, really castigated. I think that's the word I'm looking for. He castigated all of us for not getting something done faster. And everybody was, I mean, the engineers on this team were literally sleeping sometimes in the office, sleeping in the lab. They were they were working so hard on the product development side. The product manager was, everybody was working full out. And this guy comes in and rather than acknowledging what we're doing and supporting us in doing all of this, and then asking maybe for just, one or two more ounces of work and input, he's, reamed us out for not doing well enough. And then at the end, he said, if this product doesn't get out on time, I could lose my job. At which point, our trust in his care for us went right out the window. As if we really had much trust in that in the first place. But that just nailed it.
What do the neuroscientists say about trust and distrust? I imagine there's something chemical going on in our brains that allow us to, or probably affects our interactions with and relationships with people.
Yeah. So I try and read, I read articles about the neuroscience of trust. I skip through the math part of it. I have to be honest, that confuses the heck out of me. I'm not a mathematician. So all the statistics and all that stuff. But what I try and do is understand what it is they're saying fundamentally. And so I'll give you my take on this, which is based on my, any neuroscientist worth their salt would say, oh, this is way too simplistic. But I talk about it this way because it's a way that most of my clients can understand it and make use of it. So trust and distrust are both built in. They are part of our biology. We're capable of experiencing the sensations, the thoughts that arise, the feelings, the emotions that go with trust and that go with distrust, because both of them are important to us and our individual and collective survival and prosperity, if you will. So distrust is there to keep us safe. And that's exactly what I talk about as the distrust network is doing. And the trust network is there to help us feel like we want to work with others, that feel safe in working with others. So the distrust network involves certain brain structures and certain neurochemicals, hormones and neurotransmitters that are released into the body. It's very similar, if not almost identical, to the fight, flight, freeze, and there's another one now that people talk about. Fawn, yeah, fawn. But basically using the same brain structures and neurochemicals to generate the sensations that we experience and interpret as distrust. At the same time, there are brain structures and neurochemicals that, when activated, create a sensation and concomitant thoughts and emotions that draw us to other people, that allow us to feel safe and want to work with them. The distrust network works much faster than the trust network, which makes total sense. If somebody's untrustworthy, we need to figure that out really fast. If they're trustworthy, we can be a little bit slower in building trust with that person. So I think fundamentally, if we want to build trust in general, we need to calm the distrust network, help it calm down in ourselves and in those around us. And we can do that by behaving in ways that that look trustworthy, that sound trustworthy. And we also need to support the trust network, again, by doing and saying what other people interpret as trustworthy actions, trustworthy behaviors. So we want to listen to our distrust network, but use it as data. Okay, is this really something that I need to pay attention to right now? Is this person really dangerous to me? Because distrust basically is the kind of the opposite, the flip side of that assessment about trust. Being willing to make myself vulnerable to another person's actions. Like, no, I'm not going to make myself or anything I value vulnerable to this person's actions because I believe that it would be harmful and dangerous to me. And so I'm going to do all the things that I can do that I know about how to do to get away, to stay away. So rather than just jumping fully into distrust mode, taking a moment, taking a pause, saying, okay, let me just check this out. What is it that I'm concerned about here? What's the behavior? What trust domain is it activated in? Why do I see this as untrustworthy? What's my concern? What is it that I might risk making vulnerable to this person that I'm now suddenly concerned about? And then take a look at the evidence that you have around that and maybe make a different assessment or make the same assessment, continue with the same assessment. Oh, no, I really don't want to trust this person.
Charles, this has been a great discussion. We uncovered a lot of things. We unpacked some of the book. There's a lot more in it, even though it's the thin book of trust. So it's a shorter book, but it's just packed with tons of really good information. I encourage people to go pick it up. Where else can people connect with you, learn more about your work, connect with you, or anything that you're willing to share?
Yeah, my website, first of all, Insight Coaching, all one word, INSIGHTCOACHING.com. So you can find me there, find out about me there. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm just Charles Feltman. I don't actually know what my handle is, but you can easily find me.
We'll put links to everything in the show notes so people can reach out to you.
And if somebody's just going off and trying to do it, I don't think there are any other Charles Feltmans. If you look up Charles Feltman, however, on Google, what you'll find in the first several hits is the guy who invented the hot dog in Coney Island in the late 1800s. Not me, not a relative even.
Yeah, hot dogs, no, I'm just kidding.
Hot dogs are a cool thing.
They're pretty awesome.
And yes, you won't find me right away. You'll have to dig down a few hits before
we'll make sure people find you.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Really good questions.
My guest today has been Charles Feltman, the author of The Thin Book of Trust, an essential primer for building trust at work. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Appreciate you.
You bet. Thank you, Brandon.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.